Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 282nd New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for The Sound of Science. Artists and scientists discuss climate change with discussions and performances from an illustrious group of friends: Andrea Andersson, Jacqueline Austermann, Torkwase Dyson, John Gerard, Laurie Goldman, Dr. Andrew Jones, Eve O'Donnell, Miranda Massey, Andrew Revkin, Leah Luca Tiziana Sicao, Eric Ian Walker, all hosted by Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. We're also thrilled to have Craig Santos Perez here today, who will close to read a poem for today's program. We start all of our events here with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in Brooklyn, we are on the unceded land and waters of Lenape-Hoking, which still belongs to the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second acknowledgement is that Black Lives Matter. In the wake of Tuesday's guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin murder trial, it is hard not to think about the devastating violence and reach of systemic racism. When just since George Floyd's murder last May, 181 Black people have been killed by police, according to the data from the research group Mapping Police Violence. As recently as Tuesday afternoon, when 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant was shot 4 times and killed by Columbus police after she called them herself for help, just as they were reading the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial. It's devastating to grasp the violence and collective trauma of systemic racism across not just individuals, but families, communities, and generations, and to see how little has changed. Before we open for our program today, I invite you to join us for a brief moment of silence to remember Ma'Khia Bryant. Thank you. For today's event, I won't be reading a bio for everyone, but I will be introducing our host, Paul. Please, throughout the event, please have a look in the chat where we will be posting full bios. But today's host is Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. He is a composer, multimedia artist, and writer whose work immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, and environmental and social issues. Miller has collaborated with an array of recording artists, including Metallica, Chuck D, Steve Reich, and Yoko Ono. He is an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. Without further ado, Paul, please take it away.
All right. So, can you guys hear me okay? Nick, I hear you. All right. So first and foremost, I wanted to say thanks to everybody who's joined us. I know in this era of just hyper overloaded density of media events, today is a very special day. Amusingly enough, we are in the middle of a sort of an overlap with the Biden administration. Today, they're doing a huge policy gathering online. And we're taking kind of a palate cleanser moment, just kind of, we're having a feast of being able to have a huge array of ideas being presented at a federal policy level today. So, I just want to give a shout out to that. On the other end of the spectrum, we're being joined today by some great folks, and I'm a big fan of some of the folks who are joining us. And like Nick was saying, everyone's bio is pretty deep. So if you have a moment in the chat, you can easily see who's going to be speaking and what they're up to, and that way we can save the give and take of the conversation, and you can just read the text. So just there, that's so by way of introduction, the artists who are joining me, Andrea Andersson, Torkwase Dyson, John Gerard, and Miranda Massey from the Climate Museum, are all friends and people who over the years I've kept track of their work and been very deeply moved to see the evolution of how they have engaged their medium. John has done a whole bunch of really amazing projects. We've known each other over the years. He's going to be speaking, he's doing a really amazing project looking at NFTs and carbon and all sorts of other issues that are kind of right front and center at some of the shifting economies of how the art world is dealing with these intangible situations of non-fungible tokens and so on. Torkwase Dyson, and me and her bonded over. I'm a diver. I do scuba diving, and she's been a wonderful person thinking about some of the evolution of New York and sort of landscape and water systems. And she has her own kind of philosophical school as well. So she's sort of the Plato of New York and beyond, update. And then Andrea has a great series of projects where she's looking at artist books and thinking about systems in terms of rivers and all sorts of others. Each one of them will unpack their own work. So by way of that, I want to start with John, because we've known each other, I think, the longest out of everybody. And John, you're doing a series of initiatives where you're raising funds using NFTs, and that is one of the wild button topics right now. I'd love to get your take on, because obviously the carbon footprint of data centers, places like Bitcoin mining, obviously are deeply problematic. And even if you drive a Tesla and you plug into the electric thing at home, the thing that's generating electricity is a fossil fuel plant down the road. So there's a lot of paradoxes going on. I'd love to get some of your thoughts at the beginning, and then we'll just rotate over to Andrea and Miranda talking about some of their thoughts on institutions and arts as well. So, and then Torkwase, we can do kind of a circular thing back to the artists. John, you want to riff for a second?
Yeah, I can start. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you to you, Paul. Okay, so just a couple of broad, brief statements. I think the most important one is that we are in a climate crisis, a severe and very serious climate crisis. And we need to do an awful lot more than offsetting our consumption now. We need to go into drawdown. We need to start drawing down historic carbon dioxide so we can actually begin to cool the earth. That is the crisis. So I'm just going to say that. I don't in any way doubt that that's the truth. The second layer that I think is really important, and what we need some balance on, is that data is electric intensive and it's carbon intensive. And we have to have a balanced conversation about video streaming, about search, about mapping, about a whole spectrum of activities alongside, let's just say, art NFT. And what upsets me a little bit about the discourse around art NFT right now is that you have a group of creators who really are connecting with income of a sort that they just haven't had in their lives. And they are being simultaneously strongly criticized for using this forum, this space. I say we all have to be aware of electricity, we have to be aware of carbon dioxide, and at the same time, we have to have a balanced conversation about video streaming and data at the same time. And I'm a little upset about it because I think it's very unbalanced at the moment.
Okay, and by the way, just by way of giving the audience a little bit of context, you're an Irish artist. You're based mostly in Europe. I want to make sure, because he's a wonderful Irish brogue there. You're also doing an NFT to raise funds for a farm that you're working on. And if you want to unpack some of that, but you're looking at carbon. Yeah.
Back down. I apologize. Yeah. So my name's John Gerard. I'm an artist. I make digital works. I've been doing it for 20 years. I met Paul in Ars Electronica 20 years ago, basically, 18. So I make simulations, and typically they exist in small editions of software. Actually, I've been making digital wallets for my art software for like 20 years. So I didn't call them NFTs, but collectors of mine, institutional collections like MoMA, private collectors, they all have their software, my software, in a digital wallet online. It's called archive.johngerard.net. Anyway, so putting that aside, but what you're referring to, Paul, is a NFT I produced called Western Flag NFT. And I actually produced that for two reasons. First of all, I wanted to talk about culture and not about price within the digital, because the Beeple explosion was all about price. And at a certain point, that's not very interesting. It's interesting to talk about culture. It's interesting to talk about ecology. So my singular one NFT, which sits upon foundation right now, called Western Flag NFT, I produced it because I wanted to say, there's a culture here. Let's talk about it. Let's not just talk about money, number one. Secondly, I produced the NFT because I'm raising funds for a new fund, which is called regenerate.farm. And that is channeling money to biological and regenerative farmers in Ireland who are looking after the soil. I mean, the last thing I'll say, because I don't want to over dominate this conversation, is the great carbon sinks are the ocean and the soil. And at the moment, petrol agriculture is hyper violence for the soil. So it's leaking carbon dioxide from farmland globally. I would like to support creators, and I describe farmers as creators. Artists and farmers are both creators. I would like to support farmers to get out of petrol agriculture into regenerative and biological agriculture, because their industry has been decimated by markets and by such things. So back to everybody. We'll talk. Do people need to know what an NFT is? I'm just seeing in the chat. I'm like, should I explain? Somebody else explain that. I can't explain.
Okay. Yeah, we'll circle back to that. But I do want the audience to be aware that the overlap between the physical realm and where we think about art, and most museums are sort of mausoleums. They're places where we put dead objects and take them out of circulation in the culture. And you go to a museum and you're seeing a kind of a mausoleum process where you might as well put a mummy and wrap it up and drain the juices, and somebody's going to still be there a couple of thousand years later. So what John is doing, and I think to a different extent, Torkwase, they have totally different approaches. John also shows at Pace Gallery, by the way, which is in the art world. Again, there's a huge spectrum of people in the audience today. By the way, an old friend of mine, Michael Dorff, who owns Knitting Factory, he owns City Winery. He's in the audience. Michael, what's up? You get a good glass of wine on the West Side Highway. Next, the idea here is that physical objects are always, from there's a politics of objects at every level. But when we look at the digital world and what John was talking about, and I'm going to use this to pivot over to Torkwase for a second, is that sort of the politics of collecting is about scarcity. And digital, on the other hand, is infinite copies. So normally in economic theory, if you have infinite copies, the value goes to zero. And the more rare something is, amusingly enough, the higher the price. But digital NFTs have overturned this normal economic market forces and made stuff like a JPEG that anyone can get a copy of for free online. But as long as you have the blockchain associated with that, you're in a certain sense buying the authenticity of the blockchain, which amusingly enough is actually a whole cryptologic process and mathematically very deep situation that actually comes out of World War II. And there was a gay mathematician named Alan Turing, who one could argue is the father of modern computing. But there was a cryptologic war between the Allies and the Axis powers. And there's a really wonderful film. Benedict Cumberbatch plays Alan Turing. Regretfully, he died tragically because the British government had persecuted him. He was gay and a mathematician. And at that time, it was, he was just really driven to probably a suicidal situation. That aside, the tension between the digital and the physical has reached a boiling point. And that's where I'd love to bring in Torkwase and have her talk about a little bit of her process. I'm going to sort of comment on each artist just to give the audience a little bit of overview on each one of those things, because we take a lot of vocabulary for granted, and I just want to make sure everybody's reasonably on the same page. And we can get deep on any of the topics, but people have done whole PhDs about almost every word John was saying, and I'm sure people are doing whole PhDs on Torkwase and Andrew and all the different people involved here. We all have we could unpack like a hypertext of everyone's conversation. So Torkwase, yo, hey, and we're enjoying your presence from, I believe, California. And thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to just do a quick riff on some of your current projects and how they overlap with Earth Day and environmental issues? Because you're in there.
Thank you. I want to be sort of specific because I know there's so many of us in a short amount of time. Mm-hmm. So 2 years ago, I started a drawing session called the Winter Wells Drawing School for Environmental Liberation. And what this project does specifically is look at the ways in which abstract drawing deals with both the haptic and the untangible. So I think when we talk about NFTs, I'm really careful about this kind of economy, because those are also connected, like it or not, to extraction economies and a kind of scarcity. So if you follow both the mediums to what it means to extract both materials to run any kind of digital platform and human bodies to then create ecosystems to use those resources, the drawing school tries to look at that overarching connection. So I want to make sure that as we talk about the digital world and the haptic world, they're both connected in the touch of the screen and the touch of a drawing. So the Environmental School for Liberation is seated in how do these things, not seated in the ways in which we talk about how humans and how we look at humanity and how that knowledge has been developed to think about, like Sylvia Winter says, the human one and the human two, and how do we value bodies in relationship to all of this hyper capitalism, all of these histories of extraction economies, and all of this use culture. So the school is I think, is a way to think through in a discursive way how these environmental crises, both ecology, ecosystem, global nature warming, and violence in the streets, the way in which cities have been overbuilt too fast, an unsafe place for millions of people of color across the planet. So I want to really focus on wellness as a critical issue, and that wellness will help people, as Gerard talked about, shore down, right? We can't shore down when we're inevitably dealing with torture and torturous conditions all the time. So I think that it's important to think about a simultaneity around what these crises are, and they're compounded, right? It's awful, but the revolution and all of this pushback needs to also be compounded, not just simultaneous, because the idea of the compound is these things are pressurized, right? So we need to act in a way, not just that we understand these things are happening at the same time, but with an equal force to depressurize all of this compounded nature of oppression, dispossession, and violence.
That's a great segue too. I mean, between John and Torkwase, there's, to me at least, the common ground obviously is a concern for how we think about the way that objects shape everyday life. And I'm going to be showing you guys each of their works in a moment. But I want to use that as an opportunity to pivot over to Andrea. And Andrea is both involved with both a literary aspect, because she produces artists, books, and editions, but also has set up, there's a common thread between her and Torkwase in that they both are interested in this kind of setting up of like schools of thought. And John, in a certain sense, let me know if I'm mischaracterizing this, but your work in a certain sense by creating a collective farm and like sort of helping out with thinking about NFTs and raising funds for soil regeneration. There's a nice circular kind of connectivity going on between all of the works, which is why I thought it would be great to invite each of you guys. So Andrea, hey, and if you want to just give a quick riff, like where you're from, what you're up to, and that would just give the audience a little bit of context and then dive in.
Sure. I'm based here in New Orleans, and I'm the chief curator and founding director of an organization called Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought. And I'd like to actually begin by plugging another New Orleanian's recent work, which is the work of Nathaniel Rich. Some of you may know his books, Losing Earth, A Recent History. He just published a book, Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade. And I listened in on a kind of book launch the other day. And when I was reading his introduction, he quotes William Gibson. And for me, this is something that I think is at the center of this conversation today. And it's a quote that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I think for me, that is what Rivers is very much about. It's about this acknowledgement of exactly what Torkwase was just talking about, this interrelationship. He was going, as he goes through in his introduction, Nathaniel says, let's look at rising sea levels. New Orleans can check that. Apocalyptic natural disasters, got that. Forced migration, accelerated extinction, global pandemic, yes, 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 yes. And I think, when we were beginning to think about, the founding of an organization, and we talked about name, and this notion of a river became everything for us, because the uneven distribution that we're talking about, yes, it's geographic. Here we are at the bottom, we're at the river's delta, but it's also fiercely political and tied to histories of oppression and imperialism. And when we began to think of this name of rivers, we realized that rivers is a system. Rivers is a process. It was not just what is a river, but what does a river do, and also what has it already done, and necessarily participates in histories of enslavement, but also histories of liberation. It's a natural resource. It's also a commercial resource. There's no way to disentangle all of these webs. And so, where Rivers' work is really invested in creating partnership and collaboration. Our foundational partner is Amistad Research Center here in New Orleans, and we, work hard to sort of suture histories and contemporary practice. But it's also a recognition that we can't take, when I think about you, one of the first questions was posed is, what's my relationship to science? And I first thought, oh, wow, I'm not a scientist at all. But my practice began in poetry, and in poetry, I've learned about close reading and noticing things that we might experience or think of as silence or relationship, and recognizing these kind of subtle moves create entire changes across the entire system. And so then I think, okay, yes, I think I can enter into science through that sort of sensitivity to form.
Okay, and the beautiful thing about I'm trying to make sure we have a connect the dots situation for each artist here. What she's been up to, she's worked with other artists like Sanford Biggers, for example, and you guys just have a new book out, I think, with Yale University Press. Sanford's an old friend of mine. There's lots of great interconnectivity with her thoughts on this notion of the overlap of the literary and the visual. So there's, if you just look in the description and the chat, you'll see some good links there. So in fact, by the way, another fun fact is William Gibson's an associate of mine as well. And I've been trying to nudge, he's going to probably join us for one of these talks in a little while. And there's another very renowned science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, who's also an associate, and Cory Doctorow and some others. So with that said and done, coming up next, we have Miranda Massey, who does the Climate Museum. And I just, by way of preface, a lot of her work overlaps with both Torkwase, because it's the educational initiatives, and then of course with what Andrea is doing with thinking about schools as a system of pedagogy that can be always transformative. And so what she's done is leveraged this idea of a museum without walls, so to speak. It's a hyper pop-up museum that literally most of the time is moving around and nomadic. There's no building, there's no central space. And I find that really wonderful, which also has a relationship to John's work about intangibility. So let's dive in. Hey, Miranda, where are you these days? Are you in Brooklyn, Manhattan?
I'll soon be in Brooklyn. Today I am upstate in the Hudson Valley with my mom in the Kingston, New Paltz, Woodstock area, way out in the sticks, for people who know the area at all.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I think by way of preface, you want to dive in and just talk a little bit about the evolution, because I remember getting an email from you years ago saying, hey, we're starting this project. And I know you are a lawyer. Can you give us a little bit of some of your backdrop and lead us into the projects that you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, Fong, Nick, everybody else on the Brooklyn Rail team, and you, Paul, thank you. And to everybody else who's speaking today, it's really an honor to be sharing this space with you. And thanks to all who are listening in and sharing your time with us. I think I want to start by echoing your points, John, on the nature of the emergency that we inhabit, because even for those of us who are already climate activists, it can be so easy to sink into a sleepwalking sense of business as usual. And does everybody remember that great ape Lucy, who was discovered in what is now Ethiopia, like in the 70s? People remember that? So last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the closest thing to a human being was that human ancestor. And the oceans were at least 70 feet above where they are now. So drawdown is essential, recognizing the totally interpenetrating nature of the justice crises, plural, and the climate crises that we face. As you were saying, Torkwase, it's essential to moving forward. We just don't want to slip into a sense of false comfort based on the promise of federal action and international action. We need much more than what we're seeing. And it's our role to push for that as a primarily activist museum, because I will tell you, Paul, without wanting to let you down, that we are looking to scale out into a year-round location. That's an initiative that we've just undertaken. But the impulse started like this. We have incredible scientists giving us what we need people to know. We have unbelievable ranges of artists creating spaces where people can have with each other in a way that feels more safe and contained the huge climate feelings that we all can experience. So there's what you know, there's what you feel, and then there's what you do. And we see our role as a museum, an activist museum, and a community building museum as acting as a connecting point where people can come together, recognize the interpenetrating nature of the crises that we face, and learn about ways to take action that feels meaningful given the scale of this overwhelming global crisis. And so we do that in a number of different ways. We started out in a very different place from where we are now, and we've recognized that, as the research tells us, 60% of the US adult population is freaked out about the climate crisis, but essentially never talking about it. That's a huge majority of people for us to work with. And our target population lies within that group of essentially of first timers, of newcomers to the climate conversation. So probably not very many people with us in this event today, or in a lot of the online events that we at the Climate Museum have been streaming, because these events tend to attract people who are already in the climate vanguard. But the reality is, as people in the climate vanguard, our feeling is we need to be constantly growing the conversation and reaching out to people through the super powerful mechanisms of scientific and artistic practice brought together, together with recognitions about justice and how utterly indissolubly intertwined these struggles are.
Thank you for that. And I want to just show the audience really quick, 2 quick images. So this is one of John's works that I'll ask him to unpack a little bit. It's a flag that kind of looks like a simulation of oil and fossil fuel being particularized into the air. And that kind of particulate idea, of course, is what, carbon molecule particles in the air and so on that actually is driving much of our climate crisis. So on the other hand, we have something like this. This is Torkwase in her studio. I believe this was probably in New Jersey, Jersey City. And there's a stunningly beautiful kind of geometry at work in her kind of artworks. But Torkwase, I want to ask you, and then we're going to jump back to a couple of the other issues. I want to make sure that everybody gets a quick moment, but I love the fact that you're a diver and like you've been dealing with some of these underwater systems. I'm a scuba diver as well. And it's been a pleasure to hear about the notion of how practice informs not only the politics, because politics, one could argue, is at this moment is broken. I mean, it's a tragedy because the Republicans, my motto these days is like the Republicans are like the party of like extinction at this point. Like they're just driving us to this like insane moment of like lemmings over the cliff. That's when I think of like Trump supporters at the insurrection on January 6th, sort of a QAnon update there. But it's also on the other end of the spectrum. The good news is we can shift the culture, and that's where I think the role of artists, musicians, creatives can really be powerful, like sort of power amplifiers, so to speak. For every Greta Thunberg, there's thousands of musicians and artists who can help change the system from different approaches. So with that said and done, I wanted to kind of just get people to circle back and like, let's talk about science for a second, because I mean, and this, John, I think might be of interest for you, and then we'll go to Andrea and Torkwase and Miranda as well. Miranda had said that she's worked extensively with scientists, which is very clear. Do you, for your current projects, what's your, process of engaging? There's a lot of research, I know that, and then the research then overlaps with software, which overlaps with then how you deploy that in the normal art. When I call it normal art world, meaning air quotes, it's not the pre-NFT world. Can you unpack some of that? And then we'll go over to Torkwase as well.
I'll do my best. So Western Flag, which you showed an image of, is a portrait of a site in Texas. It's called Spindletop, and in 1901, that's where the first really big oil strike happened. It's called the birth of big oil. I think of it as the birth of petro-modernity in 1901. And that flag I think of as a steady state. It's basically to do with the carbon legacy, because what's not widely understood is that the carbon dioxide that was released in 1901, 1902, 1903, 1904, a lot of it is still in the atmosphere, all the way through to 2021. 120 years of carbon dioxide, it's been building up. So this is a steady flag for the idea of the carbon legacy. It is a simulation, so it's a virtual world. It's annual, the sun rises, goes down. But really fundamentally, I want to say on this public platform that climate change, as somebody else said, is really a crisis of human rights. And as it is a crisis of human rights, it will destabilize the nation state. So fundamentally, this is a flag for the end of the petro-century, which began in 1901. It looks a little bit like the American flag. It's not the American flag. It is a global flag which says that the petro-century is ending, and we have to deal with the legacy now, the carbon legacy. I'm just going to briefly say one other thing. I'm working on the new flag, which is called FLARE. It will be presented at the Climate Change Congress in Glasgow in November 2021. And FLARE is different from Western flag. It's an unstable state. It's a gas flare, which is also a flag. And when it blows, it is devastating and blinding. And so really that work from 2017 dealt with the idea of legacy, carbon legacy, which is measured by scientists. And they've sounded the alarm on carbon dioxide for decades now. Our governments on big corporations and big oil have not listened. Mostly activists have listened. The next flag, which drops, and I'm actually announcing it here for the first time, funnily enough, which drops in Glasgow at UN Climate Change Congress, is FLARE, and it is an emergency, a flare at night, a flare at sea, saying the ocean is burning. And if the ocean is burning, we are all in real trouble. So I'm not sure I've entirely engaged with the subject of science. I've just talked a little bit about the work. Over to you.
No, that's okay. It's a freewheeling thing. But I'll keep nudging the science thing because I do want to. There's a tremendous amount of research that goes into your work. I mean, so and the audience can very much hear that. So Torkwase, do you want to talk about your relationship with science? Because you have the school, and you've also been doing a bunch of stuff where there's that interdisciplinary approach. And your school is really intriguing to me because it's again, much like Miranda and Andrea, it's a nomadic and pop-up, but also sort of institutional oriented. So I just want to kind of riff on that for a second. If you can tell the audience a little bit about your school for ecological transform, your role with it. Is she muted or? Nick, can you unmute her?
Be able to turn on your microphone.
Okay. While she's doing that, I'll just sing her praises a little bit. So she learned diving to make her artwork. Oh, nope. Torkwase, if you're on your iPad, go to the top right and you'll see a button that looks like a microphone. Just tap on that one.
It should also be popping up as an option that'll say like co-host or host is asking you to unmute. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I was going to say my haptics weren't working. So it's the Winter Wells Drawing School for Environmental Liberation. And what it allows me to do is invite scientists in and to think about what is the gap between what an artist like me is doing and what the research, what their research is doing to inform my creativity. So what I understand, the premise came for it is this idea of Sylvia Winters to say, as soon as extraction happened from the continent, as soon as we began to move bodies and use oceans as superhighways, this is when environmental degradation sort of expanded across the planet. And then to be born into a plantation is to be born into an environmental crisis, right? And so the school looks at how do we understand the crisis that we inherit and are born into in relationship to the ways in which labor, body, dispossession has been distributed across the planet. So we know that, and it's really common knowledge that people of color will then suffer from global warming all over the planet. And what I think Katrina showed me, and tap into the New Orleans as a site-based example, that Katrina showed me when I was teaching in Atlanta, teaching art at Spelman. It showed me about what does it mean to take care of, you know, what I would call climate refugees when I welcomed 40 people into my home right after Katrina that I needed to help feed, I needed to help house, I needed to help bed, I needed to bring in a community at a scale that I did not recognize. So then scale became a really critical condition in which to introduce myself to scientists, a way that we could sort of get at a familiar language, right? Because this sort of specialized knowledge was very foreign to me in thinking about CO2 and thinking about, I'll say, seabed mining and thinking about infrastructures and in architecture that goes into all these bodies of water. So the way in which scientists, whether it's physicists, I'll say really specifically what I wrote down, so I won't talk about off the top of my head. Liz McGrath really changed my life. And she is into physics and astronomy. And what she pointed me to was the ways in which her particular discipline was searching for galaxies. And at that time, I really didn't have a bridge from my work to the ocean or you know, galaxy research. And what she allowed me was this pathway for her to explain to her what painting is and what sculpture does and what the creative act can do. And what she allowed in my life is to think metaphorically how to communicate something like bodies on the Middle Passage over that 6-month journey, understanding water, dusk, time, and what the body may what goes on with the body over that period of time, but most importantly for my work over that distance. So working with an astronomer who thinks about environmental physics had me break open ways in which I could think about distance in the work. And when I started thinking about distance in the work, then I could start visualizing these tension fields, right? So what you see are compositions that have this very like liquid quality, a lot of water happening, a lot of this constant idea of state change on the canvas. And then I build or construct a field that in my mind incorporates ideas of architecture and infrastructure, but in a way that really plucks out a visual tension that all of these environmental sites sort of, and how all of these environmental sites are indelibly tied to my own subjectivity and the world that I live in. So it's a really, you know, day by day exchange with different scientists for me.
Okay, and the issue for me, one of the beautiful things, and I'm going to use this to pivot over to Andrea because you both talked about New Orleans for a second. I just want to show this is an image from when the whole Katrina thing happened. The water left these sort of yellow stains at the, you know, it's called the water line. And you were able to see how it intervened in the architecture, the landscape, and above all, the sort of displacement of people. But then it went away. And so we're coordinating with these stunningly powerful forces that human beings have the hubris to feel like we're saving the planet, but actually it's more a matter of like what you like Torkwase was just saying, it's like the human is part of nature. So actually the eerie thing about us versus the arrogance of feeling like in the Anthropocene is that the planet will be here, we might not be. And so one of the issues that I'm really intrigued with, and this probably goes over to Andrea here with the rivers situation, is how does, I mean, I want to just sort of keep asking you guys, how does working in the arts and the sciences and scientist collaborations inform some of your process? So Andrea, you want to riff on that for a moment because you've also written books about some of these issues and the politics of visuality as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up really with the water line though. One of the things about the water line is it became a memory line, right? And I think living, you know, I grew up in New Orleans, lived away for over 20 years and came back. And I live in a different city now because there is a community memory here. I mean, Katrina lives with us now. We have never gone back to a pre-Katrina moment. I raised 2 children here. there is nothing of the kind of certainty of existence that I grew up in New Orleans. There had been Betsy before Katrina. You know, we heard about hurricanes before. I don't think any child that grows up post Katrina thinks my house will be here in 100 years. It's not, we don't even suggest those mythologies any longer. And I think that question of history is super important to this conversation because it's so difficult not to repeat our histories. And I don't think it's a surprise that, you know, Torkwase is talking about an organ, and I'm talking about all of these, you know, institutional bodies we've been discussing are nomadic. They are outside of this notion of real estate. And they're all new. We can imagine them differently than they have been before. And I think it's a lot hard, you know, like to think about the challenge of disrupting patterns that are very much already in place. In 2017, I organized with Cecilia Vicuña, her exhibition About to Happen. And when we were in preparation and collecting materials, we made a trip out to the Ile de Jean-Charles. This is an area in Terrebonne Parish. It is where, you know, land gives way to water. It is thinking about the end of the century, that you can see it right there. I mean, you see where the world ends. And it was a really amazing experience to go with her. And this goes back to Torkwase's comments about climate refugees. The people living on the Ile de Jean-Charles, the Biloxi, Chitimachi Choctaw, and the Houma Nation, they were identified, this was first under the Obama administration, as the first climate refugees. And there has been this complex orchestrated plan to afford relocation for entire communities. Now, in terms of this sort of historical return, it's really important to know that this was not the original home of any of these people, but this was the forced relocation home under Andrew Jackson in 1830. This is how people left the solid land of Louisiana to avoid the Trail of Tears. And so here you see this kind of repetition, and it's still policy. It's just a different policy. And so, but what was very important about that trip is to be out there and to recognize that most of my generation, we met with a lot of elders on that trip, and we heard from their experience. But, you know, I'm in my 40s, and most of those, originally there were, you know, if you looked about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there were 300 families living on the Ile de Jean-Charles. Now there are about 25. And they used to, you know, care for the, you know, draw all of their resources from the Isle. No longer. Most of those who are in their 40s and younger are working for the petro industry. That is how they survive, right? So to have, I mean, Cecilia and I were having these conversations with them, trying to understand. And of course, Cecilia's perspective coming from Chile and her entire childhood, understanding the impact of the petroleum industry in Chile and understanding the degradation of the environment and of people, broadly speaking, under, you know, this was the devastation of the end of the Allende administration. But to be there and to recognize that there is no simplicity to this. It is all, how do you tell people, oh, the answer is the end of the only thing that puts food in your mouth. And yet it's also the thing that is taking your land away and ending your way of life as you know it. So these kinds of circularities and repetitions, it is so, the opportunity to make something new is extraordinary because you can break all of the burdens that came before. But as a globe, as an Earth, we have to work with all sorts of systems that are now we're responsible to undo, and that's a lot harder than doing in the first place.
You know, and that's a really good point to bring in for this notion of like the extractive economy. I mean, here I just want to show you guys something really quick. This is a Google data center. I'll just pinch and zoom so you guys can all see that. So Google, when they negotiate with you know, various municipalities, one of the main things they use for data centers is, of course, water. And what's powerful about that is that water is the politics of urban landscapes. So I showed you that Katrina flood image when Andrea was speaking. And Andrea, what you were just talking about made me think about the sheer volume of extractive materials that go into it, the data economy, even though we think of it as etherealized and the cloud and all this stuff. The infrastructure that needs to be put in place, like you were just saying, and this is going to lead me to Miranda. Because in a certain sense, the museum is kind of a physical space. And we've always had that, at least since maybe the 19th century, the notion of the impulse to collect, to archive, to be able to have these kinds of indexical relationships to the objects that make up a collection. But amusingly enough, data collection, and what you're seeing here, this sort of eerie sense of the invisible, where there's very few people in these spaces, actually. They're usually just, like if you look at an Amazon Web Services, I went to a theater piece a couple of years ago that was set in an Amazon data center. And, you know, or an Amazon warehouse where it was just like robots dropping packages. And the theater piece was kind of, it was one of the weirdest theater pieces I've seen in years. But when you were just talking, Andrea, it made me think about that kind of the legacy of the 20th century. Is we still have one foot in the world of the Industrial Revolution and thinking about, you know, progress, the idea of the Enlightenment. But meanwhile, if we fast forward just on the near future, we're going to have to revise all these sort of consumerist impulses and hyper consumption of the 20th century, especially after the 1960s revolution of both in agriculture and actual, you know, sort of, lack of a better word, the rise of the middle class and now the collapse of the middle class. Those are all going to be things that like sort of linger over the conversation. So Miranda, amusing enough class. Sorry, go ahead.
A quick plug is to say that there's a local artist here in New Orleans, Annalore Erickson. She teaches at Tulane, and I just want to note her practice. It's worth looking up, and she does a lot of photography of data centers. You know, I've spoken to her at length, both the challenges to just gain admission, you know, the invisibility of data is so is part of the problem. Nobody and for her the challenge to even capture this, but that work is definitely worth seeing. I'll put it in the chat.
Right. And by the way, your average Google search, one Google search generates the same amount of electricity as it would take to heat a cup of water or a cup of coffee, so to speak. So every time you do a search, just think about how much energy it would take to boil a cup of coffee, and think about how many people are doing that every day, all the time, and how much energy that takes to, you know, again, if you look at, Andrea, this is going to be as a point of pivoting to Miranda, then the materials that go into the devices, whether it be sort of coltan from the Congo, for example, where there's been a low scale brush fire war it was one of the biggest wars of the 21st century, still raging actually, with child labor, even the geopolitical tension over rare earth metals, for example, with China. All of these things linger over the geopolitical context, but museums are always a reflection of some of these ideological issues. And if you look at the Cold War, for example, that shaped most of the 20th century, you had Soviet realism, and you had the CIA actually help fund a lot of jazz musicians to tour. That's a hidden dimension of the culture war of that time. So the CIA helped Jackson Pollock, for example, with some of his first exhibitions. You can Google this, by the way. It's not. There's plenty of books written about the sort of political and cultural dimensions of the legacy of the Cold War and shaping. And now, of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course, I don't know if people have been following what's going on with Putin and Ukraine right now. And there's, you know, I mean, and of course, Xi Jinping in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I mean, these are all things that still linger over the geopolitical tensions of our time. So Miranda, I'd love to just get you to sort of riff on what can museums do to work with scientists, perhaps, you know, from your own practice and your own relationships and histories, because you've been doing this for several years now.
And it's been a sea change. I'm so happy to be able to tell you all today, when even 3.5 or 4 years ago, when we were first starting to make the rounds and have conversations with people about having a climate dedicated museum in the United States, which would have been then the second of 2 projects in the world, we would often get the question, well, why a climate museum? And I can't remember the last time we heard that question. There's a very general understanding that we need cultural, science-informed, interdisciplinary programming to move forward together and to create the broad cultural shift toward a break with business as usual that we're all saying we so badly need. And more beyond our own experience as a developing museum across the world, museums that aren't climate dedicated are starting to engage with the climate crisis and integrate it into their programming. So to use a similar timeline, 3.5, 4 years ago, I could absolutely, thanks to Google Alerts, speaking of the harmfulness of that, I could absolutely have listed for you guys every single climate focused or related exhibition happening worldwide and on any given week. I couldn't even do it. I couldn't even begin to do that for the United States today, because there's a growing understanding in the cultural institutional sector, even including very, very established museums that are a little bit like an ocean liner when it comes to shifting practices. It's a lot harder for them than it is for us to make adjustments and pivot and so on. But they're doing it. And that's a very, very positive sign. We need it's not just a whole of government and a whole of society approach. We need a whole of culture approach to the climate emergency. And I'm very happy to be able to say that that's really starting to take shape.
Yeah, and you've been a spearhold, the tip of the spear moving into that realm. So I hope I've asked everybody enough questions to give everyone a little bit of context. The audience, I do want to say each of these individuals has a very deep well of work related to climate issues. So we're just skimming on the surface on a pond over whatever the metaphor is, the tip of the iceberg and so on. So with that said and done, given our time, it's almost 2 o'clock. Nick and the Brooklyn Rail team, just for making sure about protocols for time, how are we for time with questions, or what do you guys want to, do you want to just do a quick update for a second, just to make sure, because we can go, each of these people we could go deep into their zone. I just want to make sure that we're okay
Sure.
for time.
No, thank you. Thank you for being time conscious. We are set to go to the next segment with some of our musical performances right at 2. So maybe if you want just for the next couple of minutes to keep going, and we will have a dedicated Q&A later.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's really, to me, what the most powerful thing of today's conversation is sort of a common denominator, so to speak, is the way art can help change and then make more robust the conversation with the scientists. Most people tend to forget, even the term scientist is a relatively recent term. They used to be called natural philosophers. And amusingly and strangely enough, how we think of science, actually, if you go back to like someone like, Da Vinci, I just want to show you guys, the audience, 1 or 2 quick things to give you a sensibility of how the last couple hundred years, we can use these kind of conversational pivot points to give people a better sense of what makes this all functional. Amusingly and strangely enough, it's just been a couple hundred years with Da Vinci, but people tend to forget when he was working, the arts and sciences were much more closely linked. And what intrigues me about our current moment is that art and science have taken slightly different paths. I mean, you would have been burned at the stake, for example, a couple hundred years ago if you had said that the Earth circles the sun. You could have had a serious issue with the Pope at that time. And at the other end of the spectrum, if we fast forward just even a little bit, there was this thing called the Little Ice Age, which one could argue helped set up the tone for the collapse of certain farming systems. If you go to the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, the Little Ice Age, a lot of scientists have said actually helped fuel, because people literally people cut down forests. Say, for example, if there's any musicians in the audience, because we're going to be pivoting to performance in a moment, like a Stradivarius violin would not be possible now because the actual forests that made that violin are no longer around, because they were completely cut down and then replanted with other kinds of stuff. So all of these things, the tools of our time, reflect some of those issues. And I just want to show everybody a couple of these images really quick. All right. So when I was in India a couple years ago, I was walking and was it in Mumbai, which has blazing hot summer. And I noticed my shoes were getting sticky. You can actually see a little footprint there. And it was so hot that the street was melting. So, these are, if anybody's been to India, it gets pretty heavy, man. It's mind-blowingly hot in the summer. But that shock of the physicality of it and the shock of actually my shoes melting blew my mind. It takes a lot to blow my mind. I've been all over the world, but the heat was, I also have a Jamaican kind of backdrop. But one of the things that struck me is that this is a couple, a little bit, I'm going to jump from India to Renaissance Italy. This is a map of Imola, which is a battle map that Leonardo da Vinci drew for the Borgias, because the Borgias were at war and they needed, the Duke at that time, Cesare Borgia, commissioned him to do a map of the city so that they could mount an attack. But what you're going to notice is that this is what you call an axonometric representation. It's a map of the city from above. And the perspective that the artist had brought, I mean, if anyone thinks about 0-degree perspective and dimensionality, it's pretty powerful. And we'll just fast forward to 500 years later. And this is the same place from a satellite using Google Maps. And it's eerie to see the precision that he was able to draw this and actually anticipate a technology that didn't even exist. So this is where I think the arts can always give us better tools to think about what is potentially possible. And that's where I had the pleasure and honor to invite these different artists, whether it be John's work, which is dealing with all sorts of digital overlay with physical, or Torkwase's, or Andrea, or Miranda. So by using this sort of little map situation of Da Vinci giving us a legible landscape, I wanted to kind of give people a sense that even if it's a non-linear relationship, I mean, 500 years to get to Google Maps versus to draw it by hand, there's a kind of resonance that I think is overhanging our conversation here, is that the artists give us better tools to imagine what is possible. And that's where this climate change feels like, if you turn on one channel like Fox News, the skepticism and ignorance, and I mean, I just don't turn on Fox News, I'll leave it at that. But you know, how much the denialism rests on this lack of critical thinking, lack of critical tools, lack of engagement with a more robust conversation that pulls people in. How do we disrupt that? And that's kind of what I was hoping this conversation was going to, you know, sort of provoke some questions. Go ahead.
I was going to make a plug for shift it just a bit and say, scientists can help artists have safe embodied experiments, right? So how do we collaborate with scientists? So if we're interested in diving and we're interested in, you know, seabed mining, and we're interested in researching spaces that can damage our bodies, damage our lungs, and damage the way in which we may continue our own lives. So I want to point to the fact that artists can create, you know, numerous amounts of art objects that point to a thing, to change a thing. But I think that we also can create practices that change ourselves in a way that we look at things differently, right? So the art object can also be a question, right? How do we shift the paradigm of information? And how can scientists help us look critically at our own work, not only in the global sense, but our own subjective experiences as well? So there's a connection, and again, an arc between, I think, the way in which I experience John's work. The only way I can look at that at a glance and understand the absolute impact of it is because I'm a diver, right? The only reason I can understand that is now I'm closer to the ways in which extraction industries happen physically on the ground, right? So I'm interested in...
Hey, Torkwase, I just, sorry to interrupt. I want to unpack what you just said really quick. You are a diver. Can you talk about some of your experiences diving in the New York watershed? Because that was something that really intrigued me. And just to give people a sense, just a quick example maybe, because you learned diving and you got it. Can you unpack that for a second? Just give the audience a little.
Right, so actually I learned diving in Illinois in a quarry. So this was, of course, a man-built sort of, and it's very bizarre, even learning the process of diving, the different diving sites, and especially penetration dives. So I'll collapse my own embodied knowing around diving. So the first thing I did was a penetration dive, and that's looking at someone like a Nancy Holt tunnels. If you can imagine those tunnels in the landscape inverted, right? So the idea is that those tunnels are existing horizontally in this landscape. But when you do a penetration dive, those are vertical. And those same verticalities are in relationship to all of the pipeline, I'll just say debacle and travesty that's going on in our planet. So to be able to go down into a pipeline, a cylinder that you know the diameter is similar to the diameter of extraction infrastructures. So that's one thing. The other thing is to dive in the Atlantic. So the idea was to go look at extraction sites. Like, what are these monoliths in the middle of the ocean that's really out of sight unless there's a Google search? So I needed to understand what a artificial reef was. I needed to understand what the function of a pump a pump, different from an extraction point, different from the sound that's out there, and really make these decisions as an artist to say, well, what is this thing called extraction economies? And how is that related to my own ancestorship coming through the Middle Passage on this triangle trade, right? So this simultaneity that we've all been talking about, this idea of symbol, the digital, the paintings, I think all of these things in relationship to scientists, we can push these collaborations so we understand indelibly what these things mean to us, our children, our families, and all the sentient kinships on the planet. And scientists can really help us have different encounters, right? And understand these kind of precarities that exist between us all. So I just wanted to make a plug for how scientists can help us make safe embodied experiences.
Okay. It's a, go ahead.
Well, I want to make a plug, Torkwase, just to say the importance of your practice for giving shape to this kind of knowledge. And I think, Paul, this is something that you are sort of directing us to, this relationship between artists and scientists. Is to go back to this question of visibility, I think I have learned more about, I had the pleasure of seeing Torkwase's work even here in New Orleans. You had a presentation at the New Orleans Museum of Art, and I've seen it in other contexts, but to see it here and to also recognize positionality through your canvases and your work is something else. And I'm thinking here, I'm working on a project with the artist Ito Barada, and recently we were discussing a sculpture that she did called Tangier Island Wall, and she created this, what appears like a kind of minimalist geometric sculpture out of crab pots. Upon visiting the island of Tangier in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, it's in Virginia. This is an island that is slowly becoming part of the water as seas rise. But the impulse in the community is to try to insulate themselves, to build a wall. And I, as any New Orleanian knows, walls don't hold back the sea. And there is this extraordinary visibility to see this sculpture. Crab pots do not stop water. They are permeable by their very geometry, by their structure. And I think there is a way in these extraordinary practices of artists like Torkwase and artists like Ito, where you can see the kind of information that we need to hold. And sometimes it's a kind of those moments of condensation where ideas and circumstances resolve into form. And so, it's exceptional to see science figure in a form of translation through cultural practice.
And by the way, just to highlight what both you guys were saying, here's New York City actually takes its subway cars and has been dumping them off the Atlantic coast. And they're actually forming a crazy artificial reef. So that's what Torkwase was sort of talking about. I dive as well. So I haven't gone diving there. I usually dive in the South Pacific. And I was intrigued by the legacy of nuclear testing. Like I'm diving at Fiji or Vanuatu, which is a really remote group of islands, where there's all these like sunken battleships and like crazy legacy of World War II stuff happening. But okay, so with that, it's 2:06, so I wanted to just make sure about time. Any closing remarks, Miranda, John, because you guys, we're gonna go to Nick, just making sure about the time. We're gonna have the musicians lined up. And John and Miranda, do you guys have any tiny, like just quick closing remarks as we transition to the performances? Any last statements?
It's so beautiful to hear people speak about these subjects. I've really enjoyed, this discussion so far. Thanks.
Okay.
And thanks for me too.
All right. Well, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure. I wish we could all be in the same place. John, we've known each other for ages. I don't get a chance to see that often. You look all grown up with a beard and stuff now, man. It's like, wow. And Miranda, we haven't seen each other either. Andrea, you're in a whole different city, and Torkwase, we've just been going back and forth over phone and text and stuff. So thank you guys for making the time. Nick and Brooklyn crew, what's the next scenario?
Yes.
The music?
Yep, I want to extend my thanks to all of you for being here today and for this excellent start to our event. Thank you all for your input and for what you do.
Thanks, you guys.
We are going to shift over to music now. We have the Climate Music Group with us. So I know Andy Jones is going to give a brief introduction. Paul, I don't know if you want to maybe say a few words to introduce Andy, but we're going to shift over to this now.
Yeah, let's, Andy, thank you again for joining us, and Laurie and the whole Climate Music crew. I know these guys from San Francisco, and I invited them because I've seen several of their concerts, and they have a wonderful community of musicians and data scientists. And full disclosure, I'm sort of an informal advisor to them about different stuff. So Andy, thanks for tuning in. I think you're muted. You might want to, can you make sure he's unmuted? If we can do that. Okay, so Andy, Laurie, thanks you guys, take it away.
All right. Yeah, and I just want to first of all say thanks to everyone, the organizers, and to everyone who was just speaking. This has been a fascinating and important conversation. And so I'm Andy Jones. I'm a science advisor to the Climate Music Project. I'm an earth scientist based in Berkeley. You might say that I'm a card-carrying climate scientist. And I'm also, someone, I guess, part of my work is that I run computer models to understand climate change and what its implications are for energy, water, food, urban systems. And I'm also, sort of recognize that we need more than just that scientific information in order to understand and act appropriately in response to something as complex as climate change, and that we need our whole human selves, our imaginations, our emotions, our values, and our communities and culture to do that. So I'm have been engaging with artists on a number of different projects, one of which is this Climate Music Project, which is a project that brings musicians and scientists together to collaborate, to foster and build an understanding of climate change, and also to enable action. So I'm joined by two other folks from the project, Eric Ian Walker, who is a composer, who was the composer of our first major work, Climate. We're going to show a 10-minute excerpt from that work today. Laurie Goldman is also here, and who kind of represents one of the action arm of the Climate Music Project. So together we've got the climate, the music, and the action folks represented. And yeah, so then there's a short intro video that says more about our process. So I won't say too much about that because I think it's really well explained in this short video. So I think that's it for an intro, and we can take it away.
Okay, let's talk about how data is becoming music in this piece. This is an audio waveform. It is a graphic representation of audio when making a digital recording. As changes occur in a piece of music, the waveform will become either more complex or more simple. As you can see, the louder the audio, the larger the waveform, and the quieter the audio, the smaller the waveform. Our science advisors, Andy and Bill, use data sets to create graphs from extremely powerful climate models. These graphs have incredible amounts of information embedded into their minute curves, much like the audio waveforms. To the untrained observer, it's difficult to understand how those data curves relate to the changing climate without someone to translate them. It is this collision of the audio waveforms with the climate data that drives this piece. The translation of the climate graphs, the will of the music coming into direct contact with the inevitable direction of the climate data. One of the first steps in creating the score was determining what the most extreme degree of musical dysfunction would sound like at the end of the piece in the year 2300. We then worked backwards from there as a control point to plot the degree and type of change to the music according to the corresponding climate data. According to the scientific model, we used climate data beginning from the year 1800 up to the current date and projected ahead to the year 2300, with every 25 years equaling 1 minute. We could then set the climate data to tempo, pitch, rhythm, distortion and modulation, level of chaos, and the position of a knob on any music device. The 4 climate variables used in this piece, and their music corollary, are atmospheric CO2, which is tempo, near-surface air temperature, pitch and harmony, incoming and outgoing long-wave radiation, also known as Earth's energy balance, distortion, modulation, level of chaos, and ocean pH, which is affected by the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. This controls form in the music. If all of the variables are relatively normal, the music will sound relatively normal. But as the variables change, it may sound like the musicians are playing out of key, playing different pieces, speeding up, or sounding like it is going through an audio meat grinder. Also, this is a live performance by musicians who, with each performance, make different decisions about how to play their parts. This is analogous to the randomness that naturally occurs in our climate system and was built in to the execution of the piece. So this music is a sonic translation of our climate system, where it was in the past, what is happening to it now, and what the future will bring.
And so the piece actually treats the past, runs up to the present, and then we track two of these scenarios going forward. One of them is business as usual, it's this red curve. And that winds up with temperatures in the range of 8 to 9 degrees Celsius, close to about 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2300. And then a scenario where we really control emissions very dramatically and actually bring carbon dioxide back down in the latter part of the 21st century. And that puts us on a trajectory where we increase close to about 2 degrees Celsius or about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and then start to gradually cool off.
Thank you. And Nick, you're going to run the piece now?
Yes. So without further ado, climate.
Thank you.
Just for fun, I'm going to play bass.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Laurie and Andy and crew. So I'm having some wonderful Chinese dumplings here. Sorry,
So Paul, the next
yeah, go
video is yours if you want to maybe say a few words.
Yeah, sorry guys, I was starving, man. Okay, so let me just show you guys a couple of quick things just to give everybody a sense of what you're going to be hearing, seeing. Several years ago, I went to Antarctica and I worked with a group of scientists from Dartmouth's Cold Regions Research Labs. Mainly Ross A. Virginia, who's head of the Dartmouth Cold, sort of Arctic and Antarctic studies. And so basically I carried a backpack in Antarctica for a couple of weeks. And then I also visited the North Pole. I'm just going to show you guys really quick. So I've been to some pretty seriously remote places. And the idea was to do what I call acoustic portraits. And some of these shows were at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. Some went to other major galleries. It toured. We've had concerts all over the world. The idea was I took the sound of ice and I ended up working with probably one of the world's premier quantum physicist, Brian Greene, who wrote this book, The Elegant Universe. So that inspired me to go a little bit further and deeper into other systems, because ice is very geometric and there's a way, as you just saw, where musicians can do these kinds of very specific correlation between math and music. In fact, one could argue music is math. And in fact, a tuning system is just a data set. So you're averaging, a bass, I play bass that has 4 strings, E, A, D, G. If anyone ever seen a bass, it's a relatively simple data set, but the amount of notes in there, you can actually have a very narrow amount of selection in those notes. So if you want to kind of dive a little deeper and quirkier, one of the other issues that informs what you're about to hear is I started looking at where scientists had done collaborations with artists, poets, musicians, and so on. And one of my favorites is kind of to highlight the nonlinear relationship between a good conversation, what Plato would call the dialectical process. And to me, at least, what you're about to hear is basically I took the sound of different networks of roots of a forest system, and I spent several months at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in Oregon, which is a very famous forest where the government planted different kind of trees to see how their root systems and other processes would work with trees from unexpected regions. Now, I know that that could be problematic about invasive species and birds. There's certain owls, for example, and other things that were migrating through. But I get it. And what we ended up trying to figure was, what's the best way to do an acoustic portrait of that? So I just want to invoke these two gentlemen before we get into it. I'll just pinch and zoom here. If you don't know them, that's Einstein and a very renowned Indian poet named Rabindranath Tagore, who's Bengali. They always want to make sure he's Bengali/Indian. So they met backstage at the Nobel Peace Prize Awards. So they were both winning a Nobel Prize that year. And they both had crazy haircuts backstage, as musicians and artists and scientists do. And they became friends and they started correspondence. And so they ended up writing a book together based on poetry and physics called On the Nature of Reality. And to me, at least, this is a big inspiration for how I think about the collaboration between artists and science. Long story. So there's going to be a video coming up where you're seeing a very renowned violinist. He's one of the world's leading violinists. He's the principal violinist for Philip Glass's orchestra. He's an old friend, Tim Fain. And me and him were talking about the wood that would make a violin, because obviously forests have been under incredible pressure. And if anyone plays a music instrument, you have to realize that the materials that go into that instrument are part of also the climate process as well. And that we have to rethink the notions of how those instruments are derived from the history of instruments and tuning systems and other issues. So this project is called The Heart of a Forest. It's a symphony orchestra piece that was premiered with several orchestras out on the West Coast. And you're going to be hearing a kind of a remix that was done by this incredible violinist. And you're going to start hearing more and more, it sounds like more and more people are playing. It's meant to be a polyphony of the root systems. What very renowned philosophers like Deleuze and Guattari would call the rhizome system. Roots are what make up the project, but music of roots are quite mathematical, and they sort of tend to optimize for access to resources. Same with most plants, actually. Plants are quite mathematical. So math and nature, math and the notion of tuning systems, and above all, the human intuitive process of understanding a kind of mathematics of the everyday and life. So with that said and done, and Nick and Brooklyn Rail crew, if you guys have the video, we can just rock it. Oh. Thank So Tim is probably one of the world's leading violin. If you look at any of the recent Philip Glass symphony works, he's generally Philip's lead violinist, mutual friend. So I got him to play. He's in a forest out in, if I remember correctly, Wyoming, and it sounds like there's many people playing, but it's actually one person. He's like live sampling in the middle of the forest. And by the way, I write classical music and so on and so on, so notated and so on. But the electronic elements underneath it were all derived from a mathematical rendition of the root systems of several major forest systems. all of which there's my website, has all that more technical information. All right, so Nick and crew, do you guys want to, how are we for time wise? Just making sure.
We're a little behind, but such is life.
Right.
I'm going to, our last performance is going to come from Jacqueline and Eve and Leah Lepou. So we're going to start with Leah. So Leah, take it away.
What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of collaborations between scientists and artists? Do you think of one specific artwork, one exhibition or paper? Are you here today because of climate change? In any case, pick one word that sums up the encounter of science and art. And now, drop it in the chat. Is this word more about the arts or sciences? Is there a hierarchy implicit in your first word already that puts one discipline on top of the other? Arts and sciences. I can be interested in the same ideas, but as a researcher, I publish a paper. As an artist, I create an exhibit. Society puts the disciplines into boxes. How can we have an ecological impact if we remain in these boxes? Today's event is about opening up the boxes of both.
Welcome everyone to our SciSound collaboration on sea level change. My name is Eve. I'm the composer and creative producer on the project. And you just heard from Leah Luca with that wonderful introduction. Today, we're going to share our science-informed music video from our interdisciplinary collaboration with Jackie. And I'm going to talk through some of the main points relevant to the creative development of the composition and storyboard. So our collaboration has really helped to communicate the complex material in Jackie's work in a way that means that we better understand it and we're able to share it with others that may not be as familiar in a more resonant way. The 4 pillars of the collaboration are geologic timescales, scientific processes, the equation for measuring sea level change, and changing coastlines. So for geologic timescales, using measurements from this timescale, we incorporated patterns into the structure of the music, the text setting, and the visual imagery of the work. Next, we combined Jackie's fieldwork process with the method of instructional performance techniques to inform the storytelling narrative of the work. And we begin with walking into the field, collecting, analyzing, and synthesizing the results through to the dissemination of the scientific research and results. The data from Jackie's sea level equation, which gives us a better understanding of what's happening on our changing coastlines, locally and globally, was the most informative part of the musical development. The harmonic structure is a mirror of the main affecting factors of sea level change, and the interweaving instrument lines represent these shifting surfaces of the bedrock, the sea level, and the environmental factors. So the last point is changing coastlines, and in the same way that each local coastline change is different, the local solutions are also different. You can watch Jackie's full presentation on sea level change on our website, SciSound. And just to mention, it was a real honor to work with the partners on this project to make it happen. We worked with the German Consulate of New York, the Earth Institute, and Climate Week NYC to incubate and share this project. So we hope that it sparks conversation and action for environmental issues. And I will pass you over to Jackie now.
Thanks so much, Eve. So my name is Jackie Austermann, and I'm a professor and researcher at Columbia University. There I tried to better understand how sea level and how climate has changed, not just over the last 10 years or in the next 10 years, but also over hundreds and thousands of and millions of years. And knowing this past natural variability and really understanding that better and mechanisms better gives us some clues about how sea level will change in the future. And actually Miranda talked a little bit about this when she talked earlier on the panel. As you've said, the music video and composition that you'll see in a minute highlights some of, I would say, maybe the lesser known parts of sea level science. You'll hear some instructional text related to field work, some names of past geologic epochs that my work focuses on. But at the center of the works really is the sea level equation, which is an equation that captures how sea level is changing, not just because ice is melting, but also because the land level is changing and also because the Earth's gravity field is changing. All of those components contribute to modern sea level change. I think what you'll see, the composition in the video is maybe not what you would associate with sea level change. It's not devastation, it's not sinking cities, it's not burning oceans as we've heard about before. Instead, the video focuses on the theory and the science and also the beauty of sea level change, I think in a somewhat poetic way. When I tell people that I study sea level change, normally the response I get is that, oh my God, this must be very depressing, but it isn't. I find climate variability and sea level change fascinating. Earth is really beautiful, and I get to study it every day, which is really a privilege. And yes, we are in an environmental crisis, but that means there's a lot to do, there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to discover, and that drives a lot of my theoretical work, field work, and excitement for the topic. And we'll now play the music video, and I hope that captures some of the science, but also some of that sentiment. And with that, Nick, I'll pass it on to you to play the video. Thank you.
Travel to destination. Walk along the coastline. Spot the outcrop. Interpret your observation. Measure the elevation. Collect the sample. Return home. Analyze the sample. Calculate sea level change. Uniform perturbation of the gravitational equipotential surface is identical to -1/a times rho I divided by rho W times the integral of delta I over the surface of the Earth plus the integral of SL times the ocean function over the surface of the Earth. Uniform perturbation of the gravitational equipotential surface is identical to
Jurassic, Jurassic,
equals G minus R minus H minus I. T is identical to minus SL, which equals R plus H plus I minus G. Sea level changes in the presence of evolving topography. When I think about sea meeting land, I think of contrast. It draws people in. The color, temperature, shape, dynamics. Where sea meets land is a constantly shifting boundary.
Minus 1 over 8 times rho I divided by rho. Minus 1 over 8 times rho I divided by rho W. G is 9.806. Lies the sea, nor sea, land and sea level changes, land and sea level changes.
SL equals G minus R minus H minus
Land and sea level changes, land and sea level changes.
minus G.
In the presence of evolving topography, SL equals G minus R minus H minus I.
C is the ocean function.
S equals SL times C. C is the ocean function, identical to minus SL, which equals R plus H plus I minus G, equals R plus H plus I minus G, identical to minus SL. Land and sea level changes, land and sea level
Sea level changes in the presence of evolving topography. Where sea meets land is a constantly shifting boundary. When I think about sea meeting land, I think of contrast, temperature, shape, dynamics. Where sea meets land is a constantly shifting boundary. Present the findings. Disseminate the work.
Wonderful.
Hey, you guys, thank you so much for that. So Nick and crew, how are we doing for time? I just want to make sure, just to respect time, and or if we have time, I'd love to see if we could get a couple quick interactions with the composers and musicians, if possible.
No, absolutely.
I'd like to ask Jackie a couple of questions.
Please go ahead.
Andy Revkin here, and also at Columbia University. Jackie, I always kind of start my discussions when I focus on this kind of thing with, how did you get there from here? In other words, you're a young researcher at a time when everything's about getting published, about advancing your tenure. And here you are interacting with artists. This all takes time. It takes some fearlessness. So could you describe a little bit about how you as a scientist, especially a young emerging scientist, fit that into your life?
Yeah, definitely. I should say that, this work that was just presented was really initiated by Lea Luca and Eve. But when they contacted me like a year and a half ago, maybe, I was super excited to be part of it. And yes, it's very much true, as you say, like in the scientific world, it's kind of a publish or perish mentality. However, I think especially today, like scientific literacy and climate literacy is so important, and any way where we can sort of broaden our reach and broaden the impact, I think is a really critical part to the science, because not many people here will read my scientific papers, and I don't necessarily encourage you to do that, but translating really that content into something that people can relate to and get them excited and interested. I think that's a really important part of the work that we do as well. And so I was very excited and happy to work with them on this project.
Great. Paul, any questions?
Oh, yeah. It's always a pleasure to see how different people approach a similar terrain. Whether you see, Malevich, or whether you see Peter Halley, or whether you see, Picasso. Amusingly, if they're all dealing with a canvas and a two-dimensional surface. Music and science are much more about multidimensionality in a certain sense. And one of the things that struck me about Leah's wonderful voice and Jackie's wonderful presentation of data and Andy's advisory input to what Laurie and the climate group are up to is, how do we get people to access that sense of multiple dimensionality? Because it's a lot of artists don't know about science, a lot of scientists don't know about art, and a lot of musicians don't know about either. So you end up having this kind of translation mechanism that creates, especially at this time of crisis. I mean, we have to look at a forced evolution right now. Like, people need good information. I mean, you can see what's just happened with the Trump demographic and climate denialism just in a period of 4 years, how much damage can be done with wrong information. So I'd love to hear maybe, just a quick, because time-wise being what it is, so if some of the scientists could sort of riff about that sort of translation between the science and the accessibility, and how that informs some of your thinking on what's going on.
Actually, can I intervene? I think
Yeah.
there has to be, what you're doing is what has to happen, meaning creating a landscape where the two can intersect. At Columbia University, when I started here a year and a half ago, there was a real eagerness. People like Kate Marvel and climate scientists and others were trying to find ways to connect with artists and with writers and journalists. And they're just like, they're so in their own zones, and they're so caught up in the trajectory of what must happen to be a scientist or to be an artist that they didn't have that time. So creating that space and time for institutions to facilitate and reward that is what has to happen. And it's not happening. It's still not the norm. It's the exception.
Right. I mean, the eerie thing is like, I mean, Andy, I see you were going to speak for a second, and then maybe Jackie or Laurie. Andy, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I think of it as uniting science and artistic lenses is really uniting different parts of our human nature and our own brains, right? That we have a part of ourselves that thinks in an evidence-based way, tries to understand systems and drivers, that's kind of more scientific. We have a part of our minds that thinks in narrative and emotion and in relationship to social relationship. And, we've created a system where we've professionalized science and art, and that we've sort of trained scientists to be these very objective people who aren't supposed to insert their own values and stories into what they present. But in reality, it's all in there in each one of us. So for me, it's about a question of sort of how do we undo that, or how do we acknowledge that separation we've created and then come back together. But I do agree, it's a lot about overcoming those professional boundaries that we've created, and aligning the incentives and creating opportunities for people to collaborate.
And, Andy, what you just said, and this may be for Jackie and Leah and her crew, is the legacy of the 20th century was about the silo between mediums, between genres, between disciplines. And that silo effect, literally, there's a technical term called silo effect. By the way, I just got a funny message. By the way, no, this isn't beer. I'm drinking Health Aid kombucha. Somebody thought I was drinking some Jamaican Red Stripe. Nope, it's just healthy kombucha, sorry. But somebody was like, hey, give me that beer. Anyway, sorry, funny moment there. But yeah, would you guys be open to think about how we can break down those silos, because that's a long legacy of the silo effect, a century's worth of making the disciplines have those kinds of boundaries, very thick walls. And music is that kind of intangible that can move between a lot of things. So, and Laurie, you maybe want to speak to that because you've been organizing the climate music concerts in San Francisco.
Sure. And we've done events around the world actually, for different organizations. But our aim is really, we know that we need transformative change in order to address the climate crisis, and we know that in order to do that, we need to get a bucket load more people involved. And we need to kind of reach them on an emotional level so that they're voting the right way, they're talking to their decision makers. And we know that people perceive music in different ways. People like what they like. Some people like country music, some people don't. Some people like jazz, some people don't. So what we're trying to do is to create pieces of music in a variety of different genres with a variety of different musical composers to reach people where they live, what they're already listening to, and recognize that musicians have a platform to communicate with vast, broad audiences. And we're trying to communicate the science through that lens and through those people. So it really, we're creating an emotional experience that's based on science. So people are actually learning something. And that's just designed to motivate people to take action. And we work with action partners. So we don't want to give people an emotional experience and leave them without anything to do. So we have partners, and we kind of hint at what people should, what they can go out and do after they are moved by the experience and understand the experience. And we were very fortunate to have Eric Ian Walker, who composed the piece, and Andy and Bill, who were the science advisors on the piece, that they really were interested in the dialogue and how they could learn to translate the science to the music and the music to the science. And it was really an iterative process that we are working to replicate in different genre of music.
Okay. And
I also add something because it was so interesting what you said, Laurie. I also think that a crucial part is to break down these barriers through the process. So through not only saying, okay, we have the final product here, we have the paper here, we have the exhibition there, but dive deeply into what is happening in these thresholds, in these moments of epistemic knowledge encounter. And I, as a researcher at Cambridge University, I researched that a lot. So what is it about the process that makes it so interesting and that also enriches the other discipline? And maybe to tap also onto what you said, Paul, earlier. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci also asked himself, se la pittura es ciencia or no? So like, is painting a science or not? And so I think we should go out maybe asking us that very question, because the processes we find can be so similar and enriching.
Yeah, I totally, it's an eerie moment because, and probably Miranda with the Climate Museum has also realized the legacy of the 20th century over our 21st century is causing such, like, we have one foot in this old, industrial mass production, hyper consumerism, and then the other foot in this sort of dematerialized, etherealized kind of very data-driven society at this point. I mean, it's like we're using like, I don't know, a Tesla to pull a horse carriage at this point or something like that. Like, just I'm trying to think of a good metaphor here. But it's like the mechanisms how we're trying to deprogram out of the legacy of the 20th century. I think that's what you guys are doing, is helping people deprogram and find another path. So with that said and done, Nick, how are we? I just want to, it's 3:00, and Andrew, we're going to bring you in the mix a little more for the science panel. Brooklyn Rail crew, how are you for time wise? I just want to make sure I respect.
No, thanks for checking, Paul. I think let's keep this conversation going. We might just shorten the Q&A a bit. So if you just want to keep talking, we're all happy to listen. So please just keep going.
Okay, well, the scientist section was, okay, because I kind of remember we were going to do the Okay, so all right. So Miranda, I want to ask you, museums and scientists. The thing about the origin of the museum comes out of the European tradition of everything from the Wunderkammer, which is a very famous earlier tradition of moving around and gathering things. You know, but you collect ideas in a certain sense. But you also were saying that you're going to be focusing on a physical building. Can you walk us through some of that? And then Andrew, I want to kind of riff on that with this idea of institutional, like the help that people can create new institutions, new approaches, because you both are doing a lot of innovation with that. I'd love to hear both you guys' thoughts on that if you have a moment.
So thanks, Paul. And adding on to your deprogramming or breaking with businesses as usual point, the developing community is so essential to that. That's what we're doing here today. And that's what all the different scientists and artists we've been hearing from are working on. Without that sense of collective action, it will be very hard to get where we need to go. And museums, in many ways, in spite of their really bloody history of colonialist plunder and theft, are remarkably popular and trusted institutions. And being a physical space is a huge part of that, because we're all physical beings too. And there's no amount of technological development that will eliminate that fundamental fact. We're physical and emotional creatures, and being together in space is a very significant prerequisite for taking action together in a way that is big enough and brave enough to break with the systems that have landed us where we are. So we try to take a critical stance on that history of where museums are, but also embrace the contradictory positive side as an explicitly activist museum of community building across different constituencies and networks.
And, you know, Andrew, this is something me and you have riffed on before. Amusing enough, strangely enough, here we are in the middle of a pandemic, which is why we're all looking at this like Brady Bunch little squares instead of, you know, in real life. And where the pandemic is not just a biological pandemic. Personally, I think it's a mental health pandemic. It's it's about this sort of dislocation of the human and the way we've dislocated different biome systems. A lot of people have said that obviously bats, other, you know, like the wet markets in Wuhan, China, you name it, all of those are where human beings have intervened in a horrible way in the landscape and then destroyed. I mean, Brazil, for example, what's going on there with Bolsonaro versus the Amazon and the radical deforestation and, you know, radical loss of biodiversity. And above all, you know, what Elizabeth Kolber likes to call the sixth great extinction. Do you have any, I mean, because it seems pretty dark. I mean, these are very bleak, sort of evolutionary bottleneck going on here. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about tools because you're heavily involved with both music and you host kind of a series of podcasts, and they're very relatively optimistic and hopeful. And I always want to just say I salute that, because these are pretty bleak, quirky times. Can you riff for a second on some of those issues?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no one Anthropocene, there's no one climate crisis. There's a scientific definition of the sixth extinction. The time scale of it is astoundingly large. It's like the music there was so much of what that music was doing was playing with time, trying to get us to understand things that are happening on a time scale that will never really truly integrate into our decision making. So when you look at the science, like I've been doing for too long, over half my life, this is my little artifact, which I'm thinking about donating to the Climate Museum, 1988 cover story of global warming. You know, half my life, this was half a life ago, and this was 1988, so do the math. But it's an artifact, it truly is an artifact. And this gets at your point about like your attitude. On the back, we were selling tobacco. On the front, we were selling climate change. On the back, we're selling True cigarettes, I think it is. True.
Oh my God.
So, and I was doing that. And at the time, my mindset was such, and everyone who worked at Science Digest, we weren't kind of going, hey, we need to divest from tobacco. We were just doing our job in my early, you know, turning 30 as a young science writer. And so I can woe is me myself for the rest of my life about some of that. but I don't. I get up in the morning and I look around and I look at the landscape of the science and I look at the landscape of the social science, which I was so late coming to. That's my one great regret. It took me 18 years of climate writing till 2006 before I interviewed a social scientist. And I look at the arts, and as you say, I played music with Pete Seeger for 20 years. For those who know who he was, it's getting to be a shrinking cohort of people who do. I'm in a room here full of guitars and books, right? And you have to kind of, not everyone has to, but some of us have to find a way to build that hope into our lives and look at the world creatively, knowing that you have to cross disciplines if you're going to have any progress on the things you care about. If you're not thinking holistically, if you're not thinking about the climate scientists providing the climate science, and also in many cases providing other spirits and music too. Some of my best shows on the Sunday shows on Sustain What have had scientists who are musicians. A hammered dulcimer player, Karen Alley, her father, Richard Alley, who's the preeminent glacier scientist. It's a very funny songwriter. So we find our paths. There'll always be many. The artists that I've dealt with and written about come at this from different landscapes too. Some are using art to educate, some are using art to provoke, and they're all right. So the diversity expressed even today is really invaluable. And I just think, to me, there's always hope and a beginning in that. And I think that's why I keep going. And I think everyone has to find a way to, doomism is the worst threat right now to us. If if your sense of scale leads to a sense of depleted possibility and paralysis, then that's the last place anyone would want to be.
Right. I mean, the motto, the time frame thing, I mean, whether it be Chernobyl or whether it be the plastic in the ocean, those are going to be existing for probably longer than our civilization. And in fact, Andrew, what you just remind me of was this, there's a great map that Cambridge, there's the Cambridge Center for Study of Existential Crises, which is a great institute that focuses on, it's the Cambridge Center for Existential Risk. And I just want to show, this is in light of what both Andrew was saying and what some of the issues Miranda was talking about. This is a map of the average lifespan of a civilization. Your average lifespan of a civilization is about 336 years. So the Akkadian Empire, the Phoenicians, Carthage, we can just keep scrolling on up to us at the bottom of there. And the BBC did a really fun thing about the time frame of the future. So your average human, our lifespan is 70 to maybe 100 years. We are not necessarily biologically evolved to think of those kind of geologic and other kinds of time frames. So that's where music and the idea of polyphony, many tones at once, so or polytonal and polyrhythmic, where you can have something very slow going, something very fast, and they play together. So those are issues that I think music can actually help bring different tools to the sciences. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'd love to just ask, just to the panelists here, how we can get better tools out. That's because I have to admit the last couple of years was really, I know this might sound a little harsh. Let me know if I'm crossing a boundary. I'm very respectful of everybody, but I couldn't believe how stupid people were. I mean, and maybe that's, what they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people are like, the smarter someone says they are, it's a famous, Trump was like a perfect paragon of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I got a really big brain. I have the best thoughts. I can't even do a Trump accent very well, but it couldn't believe over 4 years. By the end of that, you had QAnon, which one could argue is an algorithmically driven conspiracy theory, that is radicalized using all sorts of tools that we could probably repurpose those if we did a sort of reverse engineering of Cambridge Analytica, which was what they used to sort of do a psychoanalytic model of your Facebook choices. And the right wing and the dark arts of that have kind of had a toxic cocktail moment. What can progressives or left or more people who are concerned with climate do to reverse engineer some of those issues? I just want to put that out to you guys and see if you have any thoughts on that, because the QAnon stuff was really intriguing because it was all driven by recommendation engines. Like, if you like this, you'll like that. And then, oh, by the way, if you really like that, we'll give you some other stuff. And these platforms are attention addiction engines. So they want to keep you engaged. And the more radicalized the thoughts are, the more you keep clicking. So maybe, just want to put that out as a little provocation there. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I put in a link. There are some folks working at these platforms who are trying to tip the balance. It's a huge issue. climateaction.tech, climateaction.tech is a place to
I
go.
mean, it's helpful to have, people on the art side who welcome working with scientists and people on the science side as well. I mean, Eric worked with our science team, and I don't know that Eric, I don't think that you had a background in science per se, but you were willing to learn and use your music to translate what the science team was trying to tell us.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that was, I mean, I don't think it's, there's many pieces that are out there you can find. But what was unique to me when we did the piece was because we were using climate data to collide with the music. It wasn't a case of me being able to do what I wanted to do. There were points as the piece progressed where I had no choice. My ego was removed from the piece, and that's part of the message, in a way, of the piece, is that you're not getting to choose in the way you would like to. And in fact, I shopped the idea of composing this piece to a number of my composer friends, and more than a few of them turned down doing a piece because when they realized that the data would be kind of in control in a way, they didn't like that, because you get some little musical riff you like, and 30 seconds later, you don't get to do it anymore. And things are slowly deteriorating. Working with the scientists were really great for me. We did it over an 18-month period. We were meeting every 2 weeks to check in. That was really different for me. And I've worked in a lot of theater and a lot of film, but it wasn't the same. And I learned a lot. And there was at times that it was a really stressful piece to work on, and it was depressing to work on. And at other times it was transformative and felt great to be doing it. When we perform it live, which is what it is, and that's why I played bass along with the video today, just so you folks know it was a band. When we performed it live, we weren't necessarily playing for climate deniers and people that are skeptical. We're in the Bay Area, even a lot of the places, even we played in Mexico City too. But we're playing to people that are kind of members of the choir. What was interesting was how they were not prepared for understanding the scope, like you were talking about, Paul, the timeline, because we did this over 30 minutes and we're covering about 500 years. So it gave them this chunk of time to be immersed in it in the theater. And when they came out of it, they were galvanized in a way that they had never been before about it. The immediacy of the situation and what the future was like. They could look at the dates going by and think about their children or relatives, and children of their relatives or friends, and down the road. And they suddenly got the stretched timeline, which, yes, most of us don't have.
Well, all right, thank you for that. And Miranda, jump in there.
Yeah. I just wanted to, in a very friendly way, but also a forceful way, push back on the idea of stupidity, and that being the problem that we confront. We're social and emotional creatures primarily, and only then, on a good day, intellectual creatures. That's one thing to say. And another thing to say is that, so we have this deep yearning to belong. That is general in the human population. It's not universal, but it's general. And then two, and this refers back to the points you were making about evolutionary psychology, Paul, we evolved with all these massive cognitive biases just to make shortcuts because there's too much information and not enough time. And when those biases get confirmed, thanks to algorithms that are designed to confirm them and intensify them, and it's attached to a sense of belonging and community, then that's just very, very powerful medicine or poison, depending. So it can be the poison of ending up thinking that Hillary Clinton eats babies for breakfast, or the medicine of understanding that we need to come together in community around justice and climate to move forward. But we have to, I think, be very, very, and I'm not saying we should spend the same amount of time and energy on somebody who has the breakfast the breakfast fantasy as we should on the 60% of the population that's worried but inactive on climate. Of course we shouldn't, but we have to understand what those mechanisms are and understand that they reside within each and all of us, and figure out how to mobilize them for good, in my view.
Right. By the way, I had a poor choice of words. I shouldn't have said stupidity. Maybe the more polite one would be people who, I got to work on a better vocabulary for that. Anyone out there who was offended by that, I don't mind owning the nature of saying stupidity, but I should have a better choice of words.
No judgment back. It's like a mass psychosis that we're looking at in our society, and we've learned how easy that is to induce, basically.
But let's unpack what you're just saying. When you say mass psychosis, it's actually quite financially beneficial to then monetize those psychoses with algorithms, with recommendation engines. There was a really good article in the New Yorker about someone who was radicalized on YouTube because the recommendation engine just kept sending them more and more right-wing and crazier videos. Or it's kind of a funny, I grew up in DC near Comet Pizza, and I actually had pizza there. That's what there was a guy who said he was self-investigating with a gun and showed up, but there was no basement. They thought Hillary Clinton was keeping babies in the bottom of a pizza shop. I don't know if you guys remember that one, but you're right. It's like, the eerie thing is that we need to think how these tools are being leveraged and monetized, and also people are weaponizing their sensitivities. So it's a very strange moment because the anti-masker movement, and as an African American, there's this phenomenon called the Karens. I don't know if you guys have seen those, where a woman will call because a young Black girl is selling water on the street, and she's like, a white woman will call, or they'll go into the store and ask for the manager, the Karens or something. It's just these kind of moments where you're like, how can we reach that person? And these are questions I ask myself every day. So I've just, that frustration, I shouldn't have said, I could have had better choice of words, but thank you for that. Anybody else had some, I thought I saw somebody was jumping for a second. It's pretty free form. Definitely jump in. I want to keep it kind of a fun process here. Yeah, go ahead. Joshua, you're muted, by the way. You might want to. There you go.
Hey, Andy. Hey, everybody that came out to this event. I want to say thank you for having me first and foremost. I learned a lot of stuff during the course of the broadcast. And I'm a big fan of, in favor of climate change, okay? And basically, to my understanding is that, climate change affects us on all levels, way down to the ground soil in symbiosis. If any of you all are familiar with symbiosis, okay? Symbiosis is basically the little mitochondria, fungi that are in the ground that provide nutrients to the soil so that they can grow food and trees in order to cool the planet, okay? Now, back in the days, during the great year of, I want to say it's the age of Leo, there was a pre-burial transition, pro-burial, okay, in which the climate of the Earth shifted 15 to 20 degrees within a 5-year span, less than 5 years, okay? And this eliminated 80% of the population. So what I was getting at is that if we was to understand, like the astrology, because Torkwase pointed this out earlier with Dr. Elizabeth McGrath. So what I'm saying is if we understood the astrology behind the Earth a little bit more and the frequencies with this, do you all think that we'd be able to divert the polar shift of the polar ice caps when they make it happen? Okay, so That's kind of like what I was wanted to say. What was my question? Another thing that I had in mind.
Okay, hold on. You know what? Hey, Josh, we're in a little bit of a tight time frame here. So let's if we can just do, yeah, if you can just shorten the question, just kind of keep it direct.
I was just basically saying that if we was to understand the astrology and everything behind the great year, that because every so often, this is just what happens as byproduct of the solar system.
Okay, hold on. Hey, I just in the interest of time, we only got a couple minutes left. So if you want, we can circle back to that over social media or something a little bit later. Thank you for your question.
And Josh, I'd encourage you, if you'd like to send that in the chat, I'm happy to push it along after as well. But back to you, Paul.
Okay, so let's pivot for a second, and given we only have a little bit of time left, I want to see if there was some closing remarks from some of the panelists, because we've had some great people here, and it's a really refreshing moment of just kind of how do we give people these kind of, like I was saying, whether it be Eric looking at composition or Andrew having played with Pete Seeger, there's a legacy of these kinds of dialogues across mediums that helps enrich the situation. And I think that's the takeaway from today. So do you guys want to just riff for a little bit on that, Eric? I mean, you were talking about playing bass. I play bass as well. I'd love, there's a mathematician named Stephen Wolfram. He has a really good website called tones.wolfram.com, where he's analyzed every major music style mathematically.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, go ahead. Jump.
Well, no, I've been there. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking me to focus in on.
No, I was curious just about the way that you were thinking about incorporating both the improvisational and mathematical. That's just kind of condense it down into that.
Yeah. The band I chose them because they all had improvisational abilities. And what I figured out after a while, after we were working with the data and we were rehearsing, right, is I could write things out specifically, but we were in the moment. What I needed to do was break it down into a chart where I could tell the musicians, okay, in this area, you can do this, but you can't do this yet, and then in the next 2 minutes, you can now go here. And I had two musicians in particular that were really good at noise. They're noise musicians. And when you have noise musicians, you give them a green light, it's going to turn into complete mayhem really fast. And so what my job during a lot of the rehearsing was just pulling them back and going, guys, and Michelle, to know when to go. And so there was a fair amount of improvisation, and that was also kind of built into all the wiggles we see in the graphs, because I realized when you make the graphs bigger and more detailed, there's all this variation. So it's like, okay, I can't chart that, so we're just going to do it, live and on the spot. So that was kind of part of like creating the relationship of the hard data and what the music was doing. And it's good to remember when I say this, that we were making a piece of music that's trying to continue, though the data is tearing it apart. Particularly the ocean pH controlling musical form may not have been the wisest choice, but it was true to what was happening, because it really just tore the piece into shreds. And you guys didn't hear what happens in the next 7 minutes after that. It's just getting going. So,
and that's the fun part. That's the Anthropocene.
Well, there's a part where I cheat later, where I bring back the theme that Michelle was playing during the orchestral section, and I have it try to kind of superimpose and fly over the top of the noise. And it's like this careening ship, and it almost sounds like the whole planet is tilting, if I may be so bold to say that about my own piece. But I love that part of the piece, because there's this theme and you can recognize it. You can hear it in there, but it's just coming apart at the seams. And that's right when we take a break and shift everything back to what 2 degrees could be like. So people are hearing this utter mayhem at around 5.5 degrees, and it goes down to 2 degrees. So there's impact. And the reason I chose the collision course of music and data instead of sonification, if you guys know what that is, but that's the direct correlation of music data into sound. I chose that because of the kind of operatic theatrical quality of that. And I knew that would work for an audience.
Okay.
That's a super powerful idea.
And, you know, there's a beautiful moment where you kind of realize the noise is the glue, you know, it's kind of holding a lot of the issues together. And one of the things that really struck me, and I've listened to quite a few data sonification pieces, and I make them myself, but the math in nature and the math that the human bring, I just want to show the audience a quick example here. This is Romanesque broccoli, and it's extremely mathematical, but it's broccoli, you know. So you have to imagine that nature has its own methods of creating these pattern recognition systems that human beings kind of reinterpret, and that's where we anthropomorphize and so on. So we're always bringing our own frame of reference to any situation, for good, for better, for worse. I mean, whether you look and see a face on the moon of Mars or something, or if you are looking and you see a face on a fish or something, you know, we always are projecting. And the reason I wanted to kind of just riff on that for a second was just to show that that mathematical relationship is actually implicit in the universe itself, and music is a really good tool for interpreting that, which I think you guys were doing, and the pieces I was doing, and Jackie's piece as well. So, wow, we have 4 minutes left as far as I can recall. So, how? Like, Nick, do you want to jump in for a second? Because like I'm not good at short time.
Sure, no, thank you. I do want to mention, I mean, thank you everyone for being so like flexible and spontaneous with us, and for all of your input in the projects that you're doing. For the sake of time, because I know some of us have to go, I think we are going to forego a Q&A today, but as I posted in the chat, if you do have any questions, please feel free to share them with an email or social media handle, and we'll do our best to follow up with you. But Paul and group, maybe if we want to just have some final remarks here, from there we can then go to our poetry reading. If that sounds good to you.
Yeah, how about the panelists from the session, Andrew, Miranda, you know, you guys want to just do a kind of Eric, Laurie, how about each of you speak? I mean, we got a couple minutes, like just not that long, but just like closing remarks kind of thing, which would be, oh, I see Andrew getting his guitar out.
Banjo.
Oh, banjo, that's right. By the way, that's a remix of an African instrument, don't you know?
Yeah, appropriated.
So yeah, let's do a couple like closing remarks. Andy Jones, Laurie, Miranda, anybody want to riff, Jackie? Just a couple insights as we get to the poetry area.
I can say something real quick.
Oh, yeah. I'm just so grateful for this really stimulating and also really rich building of climate community that's happening here today, and encouraging all of us, myself included, to do the best and most we can to take it out to people who aren't yet active and build that climate community every day.
Thank you. And Andy, you go ahead.
I'll just say, do what you can to create the space to create these conversations wherever you are, and the time to breathe, time to pick up an instrument you might not be comfortable with. There's some of the shows I've done, had musicians on who are climate scientists who fits music into their lives as opposed to working with musicians, and vice versa. You know, look at the data. So just find the space, find the time, nudge your institutions to do that, find funders willing to do that. And a big chunk of this is not about a product, it's about process. You know, thinking that there's some perfect piece of art or some outcome is probably not a healthy way to go at this. It's just get involved with the process and keep going.
Thank you. Any other Andy or Laurie or Jackie?
Andy Jones, I think you had.
Or Eve?
Nope. Laurie, go ahead.
I was gonna call it Andy Jones. I think you were trying to say something.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. Happy to go in whatever order, but I just wanted to call in this moment in history that we're in right now with this pandemic, hopefully coming to a close, transitioning into something new for sure, and also the political moment that we're in and the importance of art and science coming together to articulate what sort of world do we want to live in? What is the vision for the future that we can organize ourselves around as we are creating the new reality that comes after what we've been experiencing recently? And not that we have to have the perfect vision of the future figured out before we can take action on it, but bringing creativity and imagination and design type thinking into, how do we want to be living? I think there's something really important about this type of collaboration in that.
Okay. And Eve or Jackie, you guys got any?
I just wanted to echo everybody's sentiments from today, and just to say thank you for having us here to share our project with you. It's been a very important process for us as multimedia artists. This is the first time we've come together to have a science-informed collaboration. And the challenge for us was, how do we share it with an audience that may not be familiar with it? And it's really helped us develop our critical thinking in that way, and has touched on many of the issues that we've spoken about today. So again, just sharing my thanks and appreciation for everything that we've learned in this session. It's been wonderful.
Thanks. And Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has all been said. I thanks so much for putting this on and for having this invigorating conversation and discussion, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'd also like to say that the earlier comment, the earlier question to us was to come up with a word that describes kind of the art and science nexus. And the word that I chose was meaning. And I think that that's our goal for all of us, is how do we create meaning? How do we share meaning with a wider population to generate action and generate the transformational change that we need to see? We have the solutions, we know the science, we have great artistic expressions, and we just need to bring in and envelop people in that kind of shared meaning and direction.
And
right on.
I'd like to say it's great when you collaborate and when you come together with people that are from a discipline that is not like yours. And don't be afraid to do it. I think sometimes we back off and are unsure about doing that. And it's really one of the most rewarding things you can do. And it changes your perspective about why you're creating what you're creating.
All right. Well, so I know Andrew has his banjo out. So
I gotta go.
All right.
Yeah. And I don't want to waste too much time, but there's something I'm just going to play visually if I could share it. It was at the Climate Music Project, and it shows three elements together. It's me playing my song "Liberated Carbon." And there's Carter Brooks' Ice melting in the foreground. It's the human way of those electrons. So anyway, you can have it all, right? The more dimensions, the better.
I was at that show.
So was I.
That was fun.
All right.
It was awesome. Thank you.
So you guys, this is just the beginning of a conversation, and my hope is that the audience, we can all, take the conversation in multiple directions. These are just seeds to be planted. There's going to be a series. We're doing more of these over the next couple of months. I've been hosting this series. I did have a giveaway with a group called Parlay for the Ocean. They've been doing reclaiming plastic from the ocean to make shoes with Adidas. Given our time constraints and that everybody has different shoe sizes, I'm going to probably do that in the social media aspect. And whoever answers a certain group of questions will get some really cool new Adidas shoes that made from recycled ocean plastic. But that would take too much time here. But if you check the social media, whether it be at DJ Spooky on Twitter or the Brooklyn Rail, we'll put that out after. Time-wise, I'm seeing the time here. All right, so Nick, poetry, Malvika, poetry. You guys.
Yes. No, thank you, Paul. Thanks for keeping an eye on the time. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm so grateful we were able to have all of these incredible people come together in one Zoom. That's the magic of the virtual sphere. As mentioned, so please, if you do have questions, send them in the chat. We'll try to follow up with people. A few people have asked as well if we'd be saving or archiving the chat. I will put my email address in there. Please feel free to send me an email to ask, or if you press the ... button, you can save the chat and it'll download for you. But we have We have reached poetry hour. So here at the Rail, we have a tradition where we close our events with a poetry reading. I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Craig Santos Perez, to the stage. An indigenous Pacific Islander from Guam, Craig Santos Perez is the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently Habitat Threshold. He teaches environmental poetry at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And without further ado, Craig, the stage is yours.
Hafude, aloha, happy Earth Day, everybody. So happy to be Zooming with you from Hawaii. I'm going to just share one poem today to close out this really inspiring and informative event. It's a poem I wrote called Chanting the Waters. And it was composed several years ago in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and water protectors around the world. And so in this poem, I use that as a starting point and then connect with some of the water issues we're struggling with here in the Pacific. It is a call and response poem. So I'm going to humbly ask Miranda Massey, who I'm a huge fan of, and all the poetry you folks at the Climate Museum are producing. Would you be willing to unmute yourself and be my respondent for this poem?
Hell yes.
Yes. All right. So when I say the word say, you say water is life. And then everyone else, if you could join in on your own living rooms, but if you could keep it muted, that would be a little bit easier.
Yes.
All right. Chanting the waters. Say.
Water is life.
Because our bodies are 60% water. Because my wife labored for 24 hours through contracting waves. Because water breaks forth from shifting tectonic plates. Say.
Water is life.
Because amniotic fluid is 90% water. Because she breathed and breathed and breathed. Because our lungs are 80% water. Because our daughter crowned like a new island. Say.
Water is life.
Because we tell creation stories about water. Because our language flows from water. Because our words are islands writ on water. Because it takes more than 3 gallons of water to make a single sheet of paper. Say.
Water is life.
Because water is the next oil. Because 180,000 miles of US oil pipelines leak every day. Because our planet is 70% water. Because it takes 2 gallons of water to refine a gallon of gasoline. Because it takes 20 gallons of water to make a pound of plastic. Because the American water footprint is 2,000 gallons a day. Say.
Water is life.
Because 1 billion people lack access to drinking water. Because women and children walk 4 miles every day to gather clean water and deliver it home. Because our bones are 30% water. Say.
Water is life.
Because corporations privatize, dam, and bottle our waters. Because plantations divert our waters. Because animal slaughterhouses consume our waters. Because pesticides, chemical, lead, and waste poison our waters. Say.
Water is life.
Because they bring their bulldozers and drills and drones. Because we bring our feathers and lei and sage and shells and canoes and hashtags and totems. Because they call us savage and primitive and riot. Because we bring our treaties and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Because they bring their banks and politicians and dogs and paychecks and pepper spray and bullets. Because we bring our songs and schools and prayers and chants and ceremonies. Because we say stop, keep the oil in the ground. Because they say shut up and vanish. Because we are not moving. Because we bring all our relations, all our generations, all our live streams. Say.
Water is life.
Because our drumming sounds like rain after drought echoing against taut skin. Because our skin is 60% water. Say.
Water is life.
Because every year, millions of children die from waterborne diseases. Because every day, thousands of children die from waterborne diseases. Because by the end of this poem, 5 children will die from waterborne diseases. Say.
Water is life.
Because my daughter loves playing in the ocean. Because someday she'll ask, where does the ocean end? Because we'll point to the dilating horizon. Say,
Water is life.
because our eyes are 95% water. Because we'll tell her ocean has no end. Because sky and clouds lift ocean. Because mountains embrace ocean into blessings of rain. Because ocean, sky, rain fills aquifers and lakes. Because ocean, sky, rain, lake flows into the Missouri River. Because ocean, sky, rain, lake, river returns to the Pacific and connects us to our cousins at Standing Rock. Because our blood is 90% water. Say,
Water is life.
because our hearts are 75% water. Because I'll teach my daughter our people's word for water, Hanum, Hanum, Hanum. So the sound of water will always carry her home. Say,
Water is life.
say,
Water is life.
say.
Water is life.
Mahalo. Thank you, Miranda. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Nick, and all the folks at the Brooklyn Rail. It's an honor to be part of this event, and wishing you love and blessings and a joyous Earth Day. Mahalo.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
you.
Craig. That's a big hell yes from all of us, not just from Miranda. Thank you, Miranda, for your contribution to our poem today. I want to thank you all again. Thank you so much for being here. I would like to say that the Rail is celebrating its 20th anniversary as a nonprofit, and as a nonprofit dedicated to providing free and accessible criticism and community events. So if you enjoyed today's event, please consider making a donation to keeping the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. I extend that to all of the incredible organizations and people that have been involved today. Please have a look at all the links in the chat and make donations to all of these amazing places if you're able to. We're here every day at 1 p.m. So join us tomorrow if you're available for a conversation with artist Catherine Brafford and art writer and critic Nancy Princenthal. You all can now turn on your mics.
Oh wait, hold on, Nick. But before
Paul,
we
you
do that, I
wanted to
just want
say?
to tiny quick intervention.
Please.
I also want to just thank all the panelists and people who made the time. I really appreciate. I know time is, like I always like to say, time is a scarce resource in our human dimensional time frame. So thank you for making the time. Andrew, Andy, Jackie, Laurie, Miranda, Leah, all the crew, Craig, and so on. Just really appreciate it. And the intent was to make a mega mix. I usually do a large scale concert for Earth Day, but because of the pandemic, today you guys were a mega mix. And I guess we could all say it was a remix of different perspectives. And hopefully the takeaway is that everybody has more questions than there are answers. That's the point. It's like to leave with more questions. So with that said and done, just, mind blown. And thank you guys so much for the time. And Nick, thanks again for being the pivot there. And I see Fong wearing sunglasses there as well.
Yes.
So yeah, so thanks everybody. Yeah.
Yes, extended thanks. And it's kind of a tradition. You can all unmute yourselves now if you'd like to say hello or goodbye or happy Earth Day.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and happy Earth Day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Craig. What a beautiful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. All right, thanks. All right, thanks. All right, bye-bye.
Happy Earth Day to you.
Please do. Thank you so much, you guys. Bye. Thank you, Andrew.
Bye.
Thank you, you guys. Much love and courage. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.